Today I'm going to be talking about elite youth sport. Now, when you're approaching this topic from a sociological perspective, when you're looking at young people playing sport, kids playing sport, children playing sport, you always have to ask, does the system have to be this way? We have a very particular model in the United States, and there's different models in different places and in different times, right? We've had a different model in the past. So as you ask this question of does it have to be this way, the follow-up question is, who's actually benefiting from this, right? There's people who are going to be winning as a result of the system. There's people who are going to be losing out as a result of the system. Those are the things that we have to pay attention to. What are the inequalities, and who's benefiting from those inequalities and who's suffering as a result of those inequalities? So the first thing I need to ask, as always, is does anyone have any questions? All right, that was a joke for myself that was obviously you can't respond because it's a recorded video. If you do have any questions, email me and I will respond. I'll be checking my email this weekend and get back to you by Monday so you can know what's happening. On Monday, we are going to start working towards a second debate. This debate's a little bit different than other ones in that I'm giving you 2 class days to actually prepare. So on Monday, we'll have a show and tell or two, and then I'm going to give you a chance to get in your group. So I'll actually use breakout rooms so you can talk to each other, exchange information, figure out how you want to divide up the labor. But in preparation for that, you should at least read these 4 articles. You also might want to start doing your own research around this topic. This is the debate that is going to require the most research of your own. In the other debates, I give you a lot more to work with because there's so much out there about this topic, because it's so commonly discussed in more popular outlets, not just academic outlets. I want you to seek that out as you build your argument. For this debate, the question will be, should college athletes get paid? Now, I am going to randomly choose 2 groups on Monday. One of the groups is going to say, yes, college athletes should get paid. The other group is going to be required to argue, no, college athletes should not get paid. 2 other groups that are randomly selected will not take part in the debate in terms of speaking, but they will submit an outline or notes building the argument for how they would want to reform college sport, right? You have the ability here to choose your own, make your own decision. You don't have to be simply yes or no, because usually the correct answer isn't a complete yes or a complete no, but rather you get to say the reforms that you would like to see. And then 2 groups randomly chosen will get to rest during this debate. You don't end up having to submit notes. However, and this is intentional, because you don't know which group you're going to be in yet, right? Which group has to do what? For Monday, start to prepare. Everyone starts to prepare. I all want you to do this reading because you might end up being in this debate. And then we'll find out who actually is going to be in it on Monday. On Wednesday, I am not going to require that we meet. I'm going to share a documentary and a worksheet, which will count as an in-class writing, and that time will be set aside for groups that do want to meet. That is my way of dealing with the fact that we all have different schedules. People often complain about group work because they say, well, I can't meet with Joe because he works then and Sarah works another time. This is a time you're all free where you can get together. So that's the plan. In the debate itself, to do a good job, to get an A in the debate, I want you to do research, right? I want to bring some data, bring some stories, convince us of your case with actual evidence. I want you to also draw on our discussion of elite youth sport, which I'm talking about right now in this lecture. I want you to think about our underlying models for understanding sport, right? Bringing that sociological, theoretical perspective. And then also it's important to just have generally a good clarity of argument and try to be creative in building your argument. So those are things I'm going to be looking for in the debate itself. So today, what I'm going to talk about is very briefly finish up what we talked about last time and then move on to this idea of the youth sport landscape. And I'm going to cover a lot of ground rather quickly because I want to try to at least keep this to within 50 minutes or an hour. It might go a tiny bit long, but so that's the plan. In terms of last time, the key thing that I want you to think about is making that distinction between what Elias is theorizing with his quest for excitement or sportization versus Jeffrey Seagrave with the sport as an escape. For Elias, it's seeking out this space to release emotions, right? That decontrolling, that chance to cry, that chance to yell, that chance to be violent, that chance to inflict pain on another person and also have someone inflict pain on you, that chance to sweat, that chance to be animalistic, right? That's what we find in the sport space, whether we are a participant or a fan, right? We're seeking that place to escape from the civilizing process. That's what Elias is talking about. Sportization is how that space becomes more controlled as well, but it's a controlled decontrolling, right? So that's Elias. Seagrave is saying something different, right? He's saying in modern life, what we experience in the world is very complicated. It's filled with uncertainty. We don't know who we are. We don't know why we're here. We don't know what we're working towards. We don't know how, or, just basically how to go about our daily activities. Sport answers all those questions, right? It's a space that's very clearly defined in a geographic area. Once you enter it, there's a very specific way that time works. There's a specific community that you're part of. You have a clear understanding of order, which I forgot to include on this slide, right? You have an understanding of the order of what's going on. It gets rid of a lot of that chaos. You understand why you're working towards certain things and how to get to there, even if you can't, right? Even if you lose, you know what you were trying to attain. And you have an understanding of who you are, not only as part of the community, but in your particular self that you have when you occupy that space. This all seems like a very good thing. And it's also key that Seagrave is pointing out, and I think it seems simple, but it's very profound, is this all happens at the level of experience, right? When you enter that space, when you cross over those lines, you actually feel differently. When that clock is counting down, it's not like you think in your head, that clock is counting down, which symbolizes the end of the game. Instead, it feels like a real ending, right? When you're part of that community, it's not that you say, oh, now I'm wearing a Buffalo Bills jersey, so I am signaling that I am a fan of the Buffalo Bills. No, you know at a deep level that you are a Bills fan and you are part of the Bills Mafia, right? So this is a key thing. It's all about this deep experience. So there's something wonderful and beautiful about this space. He also points out the challenges. This is an escape from larger society. The danger is that because it's an escape, what happens when it becomes all-encompassing? What happens when it's all that you care about? What happens when there's actually gross, dangerous things happening in sports, but because it's this idealized space, we don't realize it, right? What's happening when your time in sport is ending and you have to return to other areas of your life? So that's the good and the bad that can happen with sport as an escape, that model. And I think this is an important way to understand some of the beautiful things and some of the problems that go along with sport. All right, with that in mind, let's make a shift to youth sport. So why is this worth researching? I think on a fundamental level, it's important to pay attention to children playing sport because of just the simply amazingly high levels of youth involvement. This shows that we believe it is a good thing, right? Why would we guide over 2/3 of our youth in the United States, even more in Canada, to this type of activity, right? Clearly, we think it's doing something good. Clearly, we think that matters. And yet the majority of research on sport and what we could say younger athletes, it's at the collegiate level, right? And then we have a lot of research on professional sports. So we think it's good for everyone, and yet we don't actually do the research. It's the group that actually plays the most sports, and we say it's great for their health, but have we actually looked into it? So that's why it's an important area to study from a sociological perspective. This dominant institution in society, the group that it impacts the most is probably kids, and yet that's the area that we do the least critical research. Not critical meaning bad, but critical in meaning trying to actually understand what's going on. Youth sport, there's these different relationships or different models that could be employed. And we've seen this already, right? Think about two ball games. We have these two very different types of play. Anytime you have a pickup version of a sport versus an organized version of the sport. In the first option, the pickup option, you would say the goal is to have a fun game, so you want to divide up the talent so you'll get the most excitement out of it. The second option, the goal is to dominate, right? If you have the better team, run up the score, show off your dominance. That's the second option. First option, going back to the pickup game, it's about creativity, it's about self-organization, it's about self-regulation. The second one is following the rules, obedience to the coach, going through drills, pushing through pain, getting that repetition to make yourself as much of a powerful machine as possible. In a sense, we could look at this through the dramaturgical model, not creating a hierarchy, but instead saying, what is the story being told about society? What is this model that we have, if it's going to be both a model reflecting society, but also a model for society to follow? And you could think about these two quotes I chose that really reflect our relationship to sport. First one from a famous sports journalist saying, "A winning is everything notion starts in the littlest of leagues. Lessons of hard work and fair play give way to gain an edge at any cost." And you could think about your own relationship in sport. Is that something that happened to you? Why and where did it happen? Or we have Stephen Clarkson, who is a person who coaches quarterbacks who have the idea that they can become successful and make millions and millions of dollars. He says, what I hope is that every parent understands that there's some 3 million high school players, and by the time they scale it down to the quarterback position, there are only a couple of 100,000 starts. Then you get to Division I and Division II, and there are 360 quarterbacks. When you get to the NFL, there are 64. When you think about those odds, it's not very good odds, right? So we have this idea. It's about achievement. It's about this, in the first quote. In the second one, it's about people think they have this path to actually making lots of money, to getting to a better place than where they started. And here's this person whose job is to sell that dream to you, saying, doesn't happen very often, right? Statistically, it's an extreme anomaly. It's not likely. Next thing we have to ask, if we're thinking about, well, what are the values being imposed from playing sport at a young age? What is it going on when all these children are playing sport? Well, one of the things that we celebrate is being a good sport. And I'd have you think about, what does that actually mean? When we say someone is a good sport, what are they showing? Right? It's when they lose, they congratulate the other person. It's that they don't give up. It's that they follow the rules. It's that they respect everyone on their team and also in the other team. Right? There's all these positive things about being a good sport. Now, there was a study done on this at the University of Minnesota and Notre Dame. So these two giant research institutions worked together. And what they did was they interviewed 803 athletes. They interviewed 201 parents. And they interviewed 72 coaches. Right? And this was a combination, I should clarify. They sent out these surveys and then they did follow-up interviews. And what they discovered was that 20% of athletes admitted to cheating often, 1/5 of the athletes. 20% had tried to hurt an opponent often, right? Not just once, but often had tried to hurt the opponent. 27% had acted like bad sports after a loss, all those associations we have with being a bad sport. 7% of coaches had encouraged athletes to cheat. The coach actually told the player to break the rules. 8% of coaches, this is even worse, had actually encouraged an athlete to hurt an opponent. So take a moment and think in your head, what age do you imagine the children are being interviewed? If 20% of them, 1/5 of them, had already admitted to cheating and trying to hurt an opponent. So in this study, the people interviewed, the athletes, were in the 9 to 15-year-old range. I find that pretty astounding that almost 10%, almost 1 out of every 10 coaches had encouraged a kid to try to hurt their opponent and to break the rules, right? So we could think, we celebrate this idea of, well, sport is where you learn to be a good sport and you can carry that to all these different areas of your life. Is that actually the value being passed down, right? The next thing we need to ask is, how young is too young to follow the adult professional model for sport when you're engaging in youth sport, right? How young is too young for a kid to be exposed to this? Succeed at all costs, maximize your potential. This is the goal that we have, right? Is there an age where it's inappropriate? Maybe it varies by sport, right? You're all reading for today that Time magazine article that shows this elite type of sport being applied to people who are quite young. This is something you are going to continue to explore and playing their hearts out. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time now because we have a week to talk about it later in the semester. But I mean, LeBron James Jr., so LeBron James' son, LeBron James Jr., had offers from 4 colleges at 10 years old. 4 colleges were saying, sign him up. We can guarantee that he'll have a spot because we want to be the first to jump upon this chance for success and this chance for notoriety and attention. We have basketball rankings for kids in first grade. So I'm going to recommend that you go, and I'll even show it to you briefly, to the site middleschoolelite.com. All right, so let me bring this over. Let me bring this to you. I find this to be astounding and also pretty horrifying, right? This is the site where people rank the prospects, the upcoming prospects for basketball, specifically for men's basketball. And when they're ranking the prospects, this is really common, right? So we could think about when the NBA draft is going to happen, you have every talking head that does anything related to basketball, and they're ranking their board and saying this is what team is going to draft what player. It also happens in college. You say Duke got the number 1 high school recruit this year. North Carolina got the number 3. Kentucky got the number 4. So you rank the basketball players when they're in high school, and there's a competition from colleges to get those best players, right? Here, if you go to middleschoolelite.com, there's a ranking of the 2031 class. Those are kids who are going to graduate in 2031. So that's right. The 2031 class would be people who are in first grade now. These are the people that they're saying in first grade are going to be the best players. Now, in playing their hearts out, it's all about this system. So I'm not going to get into it in more detail, but like, look what happened when we clicked 2028 class. These are little kids. We have a ranking from around the country. Jeremy Weaver is supposed to be the best player. This is a child, right? We have the top 20 here. We can have the comeback king, can play 5 positions like LeBron James. He's only like 8 years old, and we're saying he can play like LeBron James. All these different players kind of posing and looking tough for their pictures. I mean, look at these kids, right? These are the pro-minded 2031, or the someone 2034. If you're going to be going to college in 2034, you're in preschool at this point, right? I just find this incredibly insane. Thinking more about youth and travel sport, this is the place where we really follow the achievement model. And again, there's a good, there's a bad, there's an ugly to this. I'm not going to get into it because Playing Their Hearts, that book that you're going to read about basketball, it's all about this travel sport industry. But it's worth thinking about these numbers. The youth travel sport industry is a $15 billion enterprise right now. Although I think the Time magazine article might have said $18 billion. Right? It's hard to measure, but we know billions and billions of dollars go into children, youth playing sport. Not within their schools, but outside of schools, traveling around the country, wearing specific shoes, wearing specific jerseys, having sponsors. The estimated revenue of travel sport industry now ranges around $7 billion. So you have $15 billion going into it. People are making a lot of money off of it. And the other thing to think about is 75% of youth sport injuries are related to overuse. So what does it mean if you play basketball all year round? Right? What does it mean if you play in season in school and then you get on a travel team and have these intense practices and this intense play? The other things that we need to consider is, especially when we get to that book, Playing Their Hearts Out again, is where is the responsibility and what role do each of these agents have? Is it about coaches? Is it about the parents? Is it the sponsors, right? Can we blame the sponsors who are putting money into this? What is the goal of travel sport? Is it about more play? Is it about more fun? Does there need to be regulation? Where would the regulation come from? Are there other models, right? These are these important, again, sociological questions we have to keep asking. But what I want to do is shift our attention, right? So we know more and more people are playing on these travel sports team, this achievement-oriented model, kids that eventually want to go pro or play at the college level. But what about the rest? What we're seeing is that youth sport continues to drop the participation rates. So earlier I told you how many people are playing. The numbers are declining. You would think they would be going up, but if you look at kids, especially in that 6 to 12-year-old range, it's down 8% from previous years. Now, it's still a lot, but it used to be 45% of kids between 6 and 12 played a team sport regularly if we go back to 2008. Now it's only 37%. So as we're putting more money, as the amount of money being spent on kids' sport goes up, participation goes down. Now, we could blame things like video games, perhaps, right? People are doing other things. But I think a big part of it is where are we actually putting our attention? Now, we have the big four of youth sport, right? So we could look at the big four for youth sport. It's baseball, basketball, football, and soccer. So it's important to note here that soccer is bigger with youth sport than something like hockey. And we've seen, again, a drop-off, right? And if you want to think about why soccer is one of the big youth sports, we could go back to the sports space argument, right? What people's impressions of what soccer represents. But again, right, we're seeing this drop-off of who's actually playing. In each of these four, significant. None of them have gone up. All of them have gone down. They've gone down to different amounts. But again, drop-offs in all of them. Focus on those elite competitors. Then I actually think this is the biggest story, right? We're thinking about, well, less kids are playing, but maybe if we break it down by income, we'll see something. So let's look at this chart. If we look at kids whose families make less than $25,000, so poorer families in the United States, they've had the steepest drop-off. After 2012, look at this. Up near 50% and then all the way down to 34%. If we look at that more working and middle class families, making a solid $50,000 to $75,000, so we call that working and middle class, we have a drop-off, but not quite as steep, right? A 6% drop-off, but still much higher than poorer families. And then we have families that make more than 100,000. So that's kind of the mark that I think Excelsior Scholarship, the tuition refund program in SUNY, I think they use 100,000 or near that as the marker. So meaning you're getting into that upper middle class range. Participation's actually gone up. This is the biggest story. The decline in youth sport, it's not just related to video games, or you would see that here as well, right? It's about a decline of public funding for sport and parks since the 1980s, and that's finally catching up. That's a big part of the story. We could also look at breakdowns by, again, who's playing each sport. Let's see for boys and girls what sports are popular. I find this particularly interesting. So we can see with boys, football is the most popular sport. There's just not the alternative for girls. A girl could play on the football team, but it's rare. So we got football and basketball are the dominant ones, baseball and soccer following behind, and then track. And then we see with girls, we've got basketball and volleyball, softball and soccer. I actually thought soccer would be number one for girls, but we've still got basketball and volleyball ahead. All right, so you can see a little bit of a contrast. Interesting, but not that interesting. This one I find to be more interesting. So this is the mean age at entry into organized team sports. So on average, how old are you when you start playing organized sports? So not playing in gym class, not playing outside, but actually organized sport. So one thing we see is that boys start at a younger age than girls, but pretty close, right? 6.8 to 7.4. Generally around 7 years old is when you start doing organized sport, boy or girl, if you're going to play it. This one is more interesting. If you're white, if your family is white, you start sport at a younger age than if your family is African American or Hispanic, right? So we find white kids are starting at a younger age playing organized sport. It's more of this kind of free-form, creative, people get together playing if you're not white. Marital status, you're going to start at a much younger age if you're married, if your parents are married, than if they're not married. That story, I think, is pretty fascinating, and it's also pretty clear. What does it take to play organized sport? And all these stories are telling this. Resources, right? And especially you can see this with income, the income disparity. If you have money, if you have a two-parent family, people can pay for organized sport, and they can also take you to those events. If you don't have money, or if your single parent is busy, it's a lot harder to get you involved in those activities. So again, public funding dropping is a huge part of this story. This is another one that goes along with that same pattern that we're seeing. Students who are involved in at least one organized sport, they could be doing more. Much higher in suburbia, right? Especially at that youngest age, grade 3 to 5. In suburban areas, you're more likely to see organized sport being offered to youth and the youth playing those sports. In urban areas, it is still likely for boys. I mean, look at this. 80% of boys are getting involved in the sport at a young age, but it's not expected for girls. That's the biggest disparity. Pretty much the same in suburbia. Girls and boys, sport is good for you. Urban areas, let's get the boys playing sport, but not caring about girls. And then in rural areas, this is pretty fascinating. You actually see more girls playing sport than boys at a young age. So completely different understanding of who is supposed to be playing sport at a young age. This shifts rather rapidly. In urban areas, girls catch up by the time they're in middle school. In suburban areas, you actually see girls start to drop out and the space becomes more masculine and more oriented just towards boys. And in urban areas, girls drop a little bit, but it stays about even. And then you can see how that pattern plays out in high school. So real fascinating stuff based on regional variation. And I'd say that the saddest part is that the urban environment is where there's the least access to safe spaces of play and physical activity, and yet that's also the area with the lowest rate, especially for girls, of physical activity, right? This is the challenge that we're seeing. What do we make of girls growing up in an urban environment? This type of exercise and healthy play just isn't as available. The other thing that we can pay attention to is coaches just don't have sufficient training, as the title of the slide tells you. So according to the Aspen Institute and SFIA, which are these big groups that research sport, especially youth sport, 7 in 10 youth sport coaches are simply not trained in these 6 core competencies that we associate with being a qualified coach, right? They're just not being taught enough. Or these programs are potentially available, but coaches aren't being told that they have to do this. There's also barely any diversity in youth coaching ranks. So more than 70% of youth coaches, and this is both boys and girls sports, over 70% are male, and half of all the coaches' households make at least $100,000 per year. So what we're seeing is guys from upper middle class are the coaches and they're not getting trained. that is a problem. So thinking about competitive youth sport, we'll come back to these questions, but again, keep asking yourself, who are the winners and who are the losers of this model? Who's getting access to sport and who's not getting access to sport? And if you think that's a problem, you think something should be done, at what level should it take place? Where should these initiatives actually come from? All right, shifting a little bit. I know this lecture is a little bit long, but I want to present a ton of stuff to you that's related to youth sport. The other thing that we have to think about, and this is the classic story that's told in the United States, is that the United States, and especially sport, is this meritocratic society where the hard workers rise to the top, and this is a chance where you can have mobility. But as sociologists like to point out over and over, is we often exaggerate that belief in the mobility. In fact, in the U.S. and Britain, if we're just thinking about the economy, people have less mobility than places like France and Germany, or even less than Canada and the Nordic countries, right? So is sport actually that lottery ticket out of poverty, right? And if it's a lottery ticket, the thing you have to think about is how often do people actually win the lottery? Charles Barkley, who has never won to mince his words, a famous basketball player, was an MVP one year, so one of the best basketball players in history. And now he is a commentator who talks a lot about basketball and race, and he's also willing to talk about politics. And he actually argues that sports are a detriment to black people in the United States. He doesn't see it as positive. You have a society now where every black kid in the country thinks that the only way it can be successful is through athletics. So Barkley is very out front in saying, look, we need to celebrate sport, but we need to celebrate it as something fun, something some people can succeed in, but not the path to actually achieve upward mobility, right? Just because the odds are against you. So again, sport is often celebrated as this path, and the financial rewards can be astounding. So if you're thinking about why it's celebrated so much, I mean, look at the money of the top paid athletes in 2019. And I didn't include 2020 for a reason, because that's going to be the first in-class writing. So 2019, the top paid athletes. So Floyd Mayweather, $275 million, right? In 1 year, he made that much through having a big fight and then sponsorship, through putting on his own promotion. Ridiculous amount of money as an athlete. Then you have two of the best soccer players in the world. You've got Messi and Ronaldo making $211 and $108 million. So pretty big disparity, but massive amounts of money for each. Then you have Conor McGregor, an MMA fighter, and the reason he made so much money this year in particular was he fought Floyd Mayweather, and he also started his own whiskey company. Then we've got another soccer player, and then finally we get to a basketball player, LeBron James. Right, so we could see there is massive amounts of money to be made. I also think it's important to recognize that we've got 3 soccer players by the time we get to a basketball player. So global sport, soccer being the biggest sport, massive amounts of money. So the first in-class writing is an incredibly easy one. What I want you to do is guess the top 5 athletes in terms of how much money they made in 2020. And if you can't think of athletes, if you're not a big fan of sport, guess what sport they play. So just list the top 5, guessing what sport they play, and then look it up. So Forbes.com, if you just search top paid athletes in 2020, you'll find a list, but Forbes always puts this out every year. These are the people who made the most money. So for the in-class writing, write what your guesses were, and then just write your answers. That's all you have to do. That's going to count as the first in-class writing. Second one's going to come up, 2 different spots entry. This is the first one. All right, so thinking more about this. Yeah, people like to imagine that you're going to be the person who starts boxing and makes almost $300 million in a single year. You're going to be the soccer player who gets signed and makes $211 million, or you're going to make it in basketball and make $85 million. It's interesting, no football players are on here. No baseball players on here, although pitchers do make ridiculous amounts of money. So we like to think about it as a path to success, but how does it actually happen? So there's 4 ways, if you think about it, there's 4 ways that someone could make money through sport if you're playing at the college level. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the college level now. There are 4 ways that you can make money through sport at the college level. 1, you could get into a college, and while you're at that college, you, because of sport, you meet someone from a higher class or maybe you marry them, or maybe you get part of that network and it gets you a job, right? So that's one way. Second way is maybe in playing sport, it strengthens your resume. It looks good when you apply to a position, that gets you a job, that helps you move up the ladder. Third one is maybe it builds character, certain qualities that you can make money off of. right? It makes you a better person, and as a result of being a better person, it's going to help you in the workforce. And then the fourth one, which is the most challenging, is maybe you're so good at sport that you go pro. These are the 4 ways to make success. Now, these are all partial myths. It is true that sport can provide a free college education, right? That is something that is sometimes true. However, it's very rare, right? 6% of seniors playing in football in high school will play in college. And football is the easiest because just in D1, schools have about 85 full football scholarships, but that's still not that many people, right? So other things to think about, 3.1% of male and 3.5% of female high school seniors playing in basketball will play in college. Incredibly small percentages. The other thing to think about is free education for male athletes in the non-revenue generating sports at the D1 level is almost 0%. Why is that? Because the scholarships are taken up by something like football. And for women, it's even worse, right? 50% women make up 50% of college students, and they're only 45% of the athletic scholarships. So yes, this is a path to college. This is definitely an important way of understanding the role that sport plays in education, but it's not guaranteed, and it's not protected that well. The other thing to think about is, well, sport leads to a college degree because if you're getting that free tuition, you're getting your degree, but the numbers are much lower than the non-athlete full-time student population, right? Think about what happens when you're playing sport. It takes time. Your classes are often scheduled around the sport rather than a degree, and here I'm thinking more about Division I than Division III. You're recruited for your athletic prowess, and maybe you're not prepared for the type of the classes that you need to take. And I mean, if we look at the major sports, we can see not everyone has degrees. In Major League Baseball players, only 4% of baseball players have college degrees. Gets higher when you look at the NBA. Gets even higher when you look at the NFL. It's incredibly low in the NHL, right? So we can see disparities between sports, and we could start to think about what might explain those patterns. But sport does not guarantee a college degree, especially if you're going the pro model in something like baseball or NHL. And the NBA and the NFL are a little bit different. Rules often determine this. We could look at the WNBA for an example. In the WNBA, there's an incredibly high rate of athletes having a college degree. It's actually hard to find. That data is not very good in the WNBA. But one of the rules is, generally speaking, a woman must have graduated from an accredited 4-year college or university to even be able to enter the draft and play in the WNBA. However, if this athlete has played at least 2 seasons professionally in a different league outside of the United States, the education requirement might be waived. So that means that if you come from a different country, or you go and play in Russia, for example, where there's a dominant professional basketball league, then you could play in the WNBA. Otherwise, you have to finish college before you can even go pro. Right? The point guard for UConn right now could go pro. She's incredible. She can't do it based on the rules. She doesn't have a choice. The other partial myth, right, partially true and partially myth, is that a professional sports career is possible. Yes, it is possible, and you can make ridiculous amounts of money if you become that professional athlete. However, look at these numbers, and I'm not going to bother reading them all to you, but these are really important. Right? It's incredibly low. It's very unlikely that you're going to go pro. The highest chance you have is in baseball, but that's because you're getting drafted to the minor leagues. And if we look at how many people from the minor leagues make it to the major leagues, again, a very small percentage. Yet even with the numbers so small, 2% and 1%, large percentages of the population believe it is possible to become a professional athlete, right? Look at the percentage when you interview guys or young men who are black between the age of 13 and 18, you have 2/3 of people saying, at some point, I'm going to be able to make a living professionally playing sport. That's ridiculously high. That's 66% of the people interviewed. It's still ridiculously high when you interview young white guys of the same age, right? That's still 1/3, which is 33%. That's ridiculously high. So it's important to understand there's less professional athletes of every race and gender than there are other people of those same characteristics in other jobs, whether it's lawyers, physicians, college teachers, teachers or college professors, right? But there's still a belief that it's possible to go pro in sport. The other partial myth. If you go pro, then you're guaranteed to be wealthy and you're set for life. Now, that seems possible if we look at average salaries. Like NBA, the average salary is $6 million. In baseball, it's $3 million. In the NFL, it's $2 million. So these are incredibly high. But when we look at what happens, it doesn't always work out to lifelong wealth. 80% of former NFL players declare bankruptcy. Why is that? Because careers are so short. You get given a massive amount of money. You might not actually, there's not structures to help you understand how to invest that money. Your career is gone. You've overspent. You've overcommitted. Now what do you do, right? So you have to declare bankruptcy. You bought a house that you can't afford. In the NBA, a little bit lower and a little bit longer period, but still a lot of people go bankrupt. This is dropping dramatically because the NBA is actually led by players, has started a program where there's financial counseling for everyone who goes pro in the NBA. That's dramatically dropped these numbers. Other thing to think about is divorce rates are incredibly high. If we're just thinking about measures of stability in social life and in your family life, approximately 70% of pro athletes are divorced. And if you look at that in comparison to the average population where the divorce rate is about 50%, that's a lot higher, right? So other things to think about. Other myth that, well, there's also equal upward mobility for women. Now, with Title IX, started in 1972, which we're going to read about more later in the semester, you do have equal opportunity for women athletes at the college level. However, there are fewer pro sports teams and the salaries are not even close. So we know that there's more women athletes, but it doesn't mean that the opportunities are out there. We see pro sports for women increasing, but it's a slow increase. The other thing to think about, and I find this to be really fascinating, is that as you see more women athletes and more visibility, you actually see a drop in the number of women coaching. Now, why would that be, right? How do we make sense of that? The most obvious answer is where there's visibility in sport, then you see the men seeing this as an opportunity. So you see a professional sports team, WNBA team, they might hire a guy as a coach, right? So women were always the coaches when there wasn't as much attention. Now that there's attention and money to be made, you see more guys stepping into those positions. All right, here is the second in-class writing. So the first one, remember going back, was about you looking up how much money the top athletes made and what sport they came from. In the second in-class writing, I want you to draw on the chapter that you read on the arm, which was by Jeff Passan, which was looking at Japanese baseball. And I want you to answer 3 questions. What were some of the lessons or takeaway points from the chapter? You can just give me one, right? What was one lesson that you found? Like, what was something that we learned from reading that chapter? Second question, where does the pressure to pitch come from? So you're reading about these kids who are over pitching at a young age. Where does it actually come from? What's the source? Third thing is going back to that Clifford Geertz, the dramaturgic model that we've talked about over and over. What would he have to say about this chapter? What would be some of the things that he would fixate on? What would be some of the key cultural stories that are being told through sport? And actually, I'm not going to say, I'm going to cut off the lecture here. So I'll shorten this pretty dramatically just by making just a few very quick final points about that chapter that you read. Now, the chapter that you read was really part of this large examination of, as the title of the book tells you, about the arm. In a sense, this is both the most valuable and most destroyed body part in sport, right? This is the thing that we obsess with especially in baseball, and it shows that sport is both good for us, but when it's pushed to this level, it's also really bad for us. Right? You have the best athletes in the world. If you're a pitcher, you've got the strongest arm in the world and you have all this training to make it as strong as physically possible, but it's also where the most damage occurs, through overuse. And think about how much money is invested in this. In Major League Baseball, $1.5 billion is spent on pitchers' salaries. Just the pitcher. That's 5 times the combined cost of every quarterback. That's more than the top 200 NBA salaries spent on the pitcher. Right? And yet, even with $1.5 billion spent, more than 50% of pitchers end up on the disabled list every single year. And 1/4 of pitchers have had Tommy John surgery, right? That's pretty insane to think about. It's the most valuable thing, but it's also the most destroyed thing in sport. As of 2015, 57% of UCL reconstructions are performed on teenagers. right? So this is kids who are pitching a lot at very young ages are overusing their arms. If you play travel baseball, you're 5 times more likely to need this surgery, which probably isn't surprising because it means you're just using that body part more and more. You're wearing it down. You're giving less time to rest and less time to recover. Part of it is the system we have, right? How do you know that you're good? You show off for the radar gun, and you do it before your body's fully developed. That's what scouts care about. What is that number that they can take back to their team and say, I saw this kid throwing 90 miles an hour. It's not about how well you pitch when you're going against someone, how many strikeouts you have. What scouts are interested more and more is just that fastball speed, not about control. I mean, that difference of just a few miles can mean the difference between the majors and minors, or just like playing wiffle ball in the park across from my house with me, right? Just a few miles an hour difference. So we care so much about the radar gun. Well, of course, there's more pressure to pitch fast and more pressure to potentially injure yourself. This is a result of modern sport, right? You're taking a motion that had some sort of value, right? You're hunting with a spear or something like that, and we've made it more and more specialized, and the game becomes more and more narrow and refined to the point, again, that you're just overusing it and you're becoming better and better at that motion, but it's more than the human body can physically handle. It's looking at the body as a machine, but the body actually can't keep up with that expectation. And it's pretty interesting on this point, is that it's really fascinating if you go back, and the book does this. I recommend reading The Arm if you have time. Really good book. It's a good audiobook also. But they used to use all these different ways to try to cure problems. So when a pitcher in the 1930s had shoulder or elbow pain, they would actually pull their teeth because they thought there was a connection between the dental cavities and the body, and that would be causing the problem. And what we've done to try to solve pain and solve the issues of the body has varied through years. And every time we go back a few years and look at what used to be done, it just seems kind of barbaric. So that is where I'm going to end. So I know I rushed through a lot really fast, but hopefully this sets the stage for thinking about asking key questions about youth sport, and then also setting up some of the key questions we're going to ask when we're looking at college athletes and saying, well, what's going on with this college system? How do we want to change it? And should athletes be paid or not, right? The basic question of the debate.